Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about big ideas and the events in their lives that have helped shape them. I apologise for my voice. I've got a weird laryngitis, but I'm basically fine. But if it doesn't sound like me, that's why. This week, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, who is seeking a third term next year and has written a book called Breathe about why tackling the climate emergency has become his defining policy. It starts with his diagnosis with asthma as an adult and turns into, well, a clever preemptive strike on his Conservative opponents who are set to fight the next London election, attacking his ultra-low emission zone, or ULEZ, which charges the drivers of older, more polluting vehicles to drive in London, and which he has steadily expanded to cover more areas. But there's much more to discuss today, not least the crisis in policing London, violent crime, and the possibility, of course, of a Labour government in Downing Street. Sadiq, welcome.
Great to be with you, Krishnan.
You have framed this as about the climate emergency. I mean, this is sort of about your change of heart along the way.
Yeah, it's not a political memoir. It is my personal story and my journey. And let me just say at the outset, I'm not the perfect green activist, and one of the concerns I have is people think that unless you're perfect, you can't get involved in this issue. But also, listen, I'm somebody who, when I was a lawyer and I was offered a salaried partnership, I negotiated not a pay rise or the corner office, but a car park space on the road of my firm for my Saab convertible. I'm somebody, when our first daughter was born, and it was a nightmare getting the car seat into the back of a 2-door Saab convertible, bought a Land Rover Discovery, even though I left London probably 4 times, never went off-roading. I'm somebody who, as an MP, as a minister, voted to have a third runway, in 2009. So the reason why I tell you that is because I've got to be honest with you and also your listeners and the reader of the book about my own journey. And it's self-interest, Krishnan. Look, in 2014, I was asked to run the London Marathon, ostensibly to raise money for charity. Actually, I was one of Ed Balls' rejects. Ed Balls said no. And so I said yes. And then I got a full medical before I ran the marathon, did the marathon, raised lots of money. And then I noticed a few weeks and months afterwards, what I later discovered was a diagnosis of asthma. So the book is my story in relation to that diagnosis. And actually, if you tackle climate change, you also tackle air pollution.
I mean, I've had a similar experience, actually, having been diagnosed with adult asthma from riding through London streets and never having had asthma before. So air quality is a huge issue, but it never really got a huge amount of attention.
Spot on.
And perhaps it did with the death of a young girl and her family's pretty relentless campaign, which we covered on Channel 4 News actually at the time, to get a proper blame for her death.
Well, what Rosamond, who's Ella's mum, you're talking about the case of Ella Adu Kissy Deborah. So Ella, when she was 7, was diagnosed with a severe form of asthma. And her mum, who's an amazing human being, had no idea what caused the attacks and so forth. A number of occasions before she eventually passed away in 2013, aged 9. Rosamond did CPR on her, brought her back to life. She was an inpatient. She passed away, unfortunately, in 2013. And the cause of death was a severe asthma attack. But Rosamond had questions in relation to what caused her daughter to have the asthma attack, what exacerbated it, what led to her death. And she very sensibly kept some of Ella's tissues before she buried Ella. But also she was fortuitous. She met a lawyer, Jocelyn Coburn, who used to work with me when I used to be a lawyer. And she met this wonderful expert, Professor Stephen Holgate. And they subsequently discovered, and it's remarkable when you think about it now, but it was really remarkable then. But you could do a graph. Every day Ella had an attack or was sick and was rushed to hospital was also a day when the air pollution was bad, the traffic was bad outside her home. She lived near the South Circular. And I supported her campaign to get a second inquest. And at that second inquest, the coroner concluded for the first time in history that air pollution was a causal factor in her death. And that's really important because what that does now is, I don't mean this in any way to give the impression I'm using Ella, but it humanises this really important issue. And I compare it to when I was an MP in 2006, there was a vote in Parliament to ban smoking in public places. And the Labour government was so concerned about the opposition, it was a free vote. That means basically there's no whip. Everyone can vote however they want. And there was a man called Roy Castle, and our children won't know who Roy Castle is, but Roy Castle presented the Record Breakers.
Yeah.
He was a
Great trumpet player. Yeah.
A great trumpet player who never smoked a fag a day in his life, but went to work in men's clubs to play the trumpet and got lung cancer. And Roy Castle was an example of the consequences of secondhand smoking. And that meant many of us could explain in lay people's terms the dangers of being in a pub when somebody else is smoking, or being in a car when somebody else is smoking, and so forth. And I think similarly, Ella's really important to my story, because I only discovered about Ella once I became the mayor in 2016. Ella's a South Londoner, but for the grace of God, it could have, Rosamond could be me because of my children, or, my mum. But also you and I, when we have an asthma attack, adults, we can rationalize it, we can take medication, we can take preventative action. Imagine poor Ella.
Yeah, I mean, so this has become the sort of the driving rationale behind your ULEZ policies. And I suppose it's one of those things where, as mayor of London, you don't have control over a huge number of things, but one of the things you do have control over is transport in London. I'm sort of explaining this for people who don't necessarily live in London and won't follow all of this. But this gives you a big policy lever, but it's under attack, particularly in the cost of living crisis, because of, a lot of tradespeople, lower income families who've got old cars who are now being hit by big charges every day. Now, you write about this, and you write about an example of a tradesman, accosting you and arguing with you about why it was wrong. What you don't do in the book is explain what the answer is. You just say, well, it's quite difficult when those conversations happen.
Oh, no, you've clearly not got to the right chapter. So there are 7 chapters in the book which deal with the 7 main obstacles I've faced from, fatalism. There's nothing we can do about this, to apathy, it doesn't concern me, to cynicism, all you politicians are the same, to deprioritization, this is much more important than that. Let's forget climate change because, the cost of living crisis is more important, to hostility, which is what you're articulating now in relation to opposition to ULEZ, and then there's cost and gridlock. So there are solutions to the opposition you're talking about. And actually, I faced the same opposition in 2017 when I first announced the policy, and we started the T-charge. Yeah. In 2019, when the T-charge became the ultra-low emission zone in central London, we expanded it in 2021 to inner London, and now. And so you've got the hostility. Some of it is people with legitimate concerns, which demand addressing, and I'll come to that in a second. But latching on to those decent people with genuine concerns are people with vested interests, often, by the way, the same people who are conspiracy theorists, anti-vaxxers, anti-lockdown, and so forth. And they latch on to a campaign like those with genuine concerns have against the ultra-low emission zone. And the response is simple. The response is to address their concerns. It's the jargon that green activists use is just transition. What that basically means is we're going to transition to a clean economy, a green economy, tackle climate change and air pollution. We've got to make sure it's fair to those who suffer the consequences. And here's the irony. Those least responsible for air pollution suffer the most consequences. So it's those, half of our city don't own a car. Half of Londoners don't own a car. In outer London, which is where I'm expanding it to next, 70% of those who earn below £10,000 don't own a car. Those who earn between £10,000 and £20,000, 54% don't own a car. And so for those that do own a car, we've got a scrappage scheme, not a penny of government money, to support them make the transition. Low-income families, charities, small businesses, it's
not really enough,
traders.
Though, is it? I mean, you get, a couple of £1,000s for a car?
No, it's up to £10,000.
And up to £10,000 on a van. Yeah. I mean, a van costs, 40 grand?
Well, no, you can get, no, because what I'm not saying to anybody is you must buy an electric vehicle. So the policy applies on the principle of polluter pays. So if you're polluting, you should pay for the consequences of your pollution or make the transition. When we first announced the policy in 2017, only 39% of vehicles in London were compliant. In other words, more than 6 out of 10 vehicles were polluting. That figure is now 94% in inner London. It's more than 90% in outer London. So people already are making the transition, because to be compliant, in other words, to have a vehicle that's not as polluting, for a petrol vehicle, roughly speaking, it's got to be a vehicle that's newer than 2006, and for a diesel vehicle, a vehicle newer than 2015. So we're accelerating people's either transition to walking, cycling, public transport, or getting a cleaner vehicle.
And do you think that's the answer? Taxing things that are bad and making them difficult to use is the big answer for these big policy challenges, because you can apply it to food and sugar and all those sorts of things as well.
Yeah, it's the question I asked in 2016 when I became the mayor. I obviously asked the question before when I was running for mayor, and the answer is look at the history of our city. In the mid 19th century, if you and I were talking now, we'd be talking about our experience coming here and the great stink. We could smell our open sewers causing thousands of deaths because of cholera. And the solution then was building sewers, right? Which was a huge inconvenience to those living in and around open sewers and so forth. But bold and brave politicians made the decision to clean up our open sewers. Similarly, you and I were talking in the middle of the 20th century, we'd be talking in advance of being interviewed about the great smog I had to get through to get here. You could see the stuff because of power stations in the center of our city, Battersea Power Station, what is now the problem with air pollution, you can't see it or smell it. And so the solution is a number of different things. One is educating people, because unlike the great smog, which you could see, or the great stink, which you could smell, people aren't aware about the poison that we're breathing in. So in my first year as mayor, we implemented the largest number of air quality monitors of any city in the world. So you can now in real time know how good or bad the air is. And the reason why that was important was we had to, I don't want to say scare Londoners, we had to turn an environmental crisis, climate change, into a health crisis, air pollution, and people needed to be aware how bad things were. And then we do a number of different things, making it better to use public transport, cheaper to use public transport, widen the pavements. We've increased fivefold the amount of cycle lanes, but also apply the principle of polluter pays. If you are still notwithstanding all the other options, going to want to drive a vehicle, unless it's a cleaner vehicle, you're going to pay the price.
I mean, a lot of people feel that, motorists feel that there is a war on the car. I mean, are you sort of bold enough to say, well, I am really waging war on the car. I don't want cars in London. I want people out of their vehicles.
No, this is not a war on the motorists. It is war on
because driving around London has got harder and harder, slower and slower. It's more and more annoying,
But let me tell you an unintended benefit of my policy. So a big challenge we have, I mentioned climate change and air pollution, but also congestion. Congestion is a problem in our city. So we're ostensibly a Roman village that over 2,000 years has expanded to a Roman village of now 400 villages, a population south of 10 million, but when people work on a normal day and tourists north of 10 million, it's simply not realistic for everyone to jump in the car. So if we want less congestion to allow our plumbers, electricians, taxis, buses to use our roads, those that don't need to be driving should be encouraged, incentivized not to be driving. And I make this point, if you're driving a polluting vehicle, not only are you breathing in poison, the two kids in the back are breathing in poison as well. So I've got to, in a non-patronizing way, educate you the consequences of you driving. But if it's possible for you to be encouraged not to, then we've got to do that, because we're going to free up our roads to have less congestion. And it's a remarkable stat we discovered, which is 2/3 of car journeys in London, 2/3 can be cycled or walked in less than 20 minutes. So if you can encourage people, it's got to be safer to cycle. You've got to feel confident cycling. There's got to be wider pavements. We should try and do so.
I totally take your point on how the people who suffer the most from climate change, this is global as well as in London, are the poorest.
Micro and macro, yeah.
But equally, when it comes to those who do use the roads, is not the result of this kind of policy that it becomes people like me who can afford to buy an electric car and drive into London. And, so the rich can still drive around, but ordinary people can't.
So that was the argument used in 2017 when I first introduced the toxicity charge. I was told nobody would ever come into central London. Electricians would go bust, plumbers would go out of business, central London would become a ghost town. None of that happened, but also in 2 years, the results we got in London were the most impressive, according to experts from Imperial College to WHO, had been seen in the world. So in 2 years, we managed to reduce the toxicity in our air by almost 50%, nitrogen oxide down by 44%, particulate matters down by more than 27%, carbon emissions down by 6% in just 2 years. So those least responsible for air pollution and climate change were seeing the most benefits from our policies. We then expanded it to inner London. For those that don't know, that's up to the North Circular and up to the South Circular. Again, I was told what you're framing is spot on in relation to what I was told. Listen, aren't you going to be pricing people off the roads who can least afford it, and it'll just be the preserve of those who are wealthier? Not the case. Because of the scrappage scheme we had then, families benefited from the transition. They bought cleaner vehicles if they needed a car, or took alternatives. A further 21% improvement in the air in London. But here's the point. In outer London is where more than 5 million people live. The worst number of premature deaths are in the 10 boroughs in outer London. 5 million people. There are 500,000 people in our city, half a million people with asthma and respiratory issues. More than 2/3 live in outer London. By the way, poorer Londoners, older Londoners, least likely to own a car.
I mean, you frame this as a big idea, and you write about that in the book as well. Do you think there are enough big ideas in politics?
One of the things I've realised is there are, but my profession are scared of them. And that's why this book isn't written just for mayors or politicians or the next Labour government. It's also written for ordinary people and activists, because when you have these big ideas, there are obstacles put in front of you why you shouldn't do this, sometimes good reasons. And one of my frustrations is actually there are some really good ideas from academics, think tanks and so forth, and my profession rejects them because they're really hard to do. And ex-politicians write books about what they did in government, not doing the big ideas.
Or what they should have done.
What they should have done. And so this is a book which is written in real time while I've got the levers.
You have your levers on transport, as I discussed. What you don't really have is the ability, it seems, to really transform emissions from homes. And that's the big one. So, but perhaps you should be campaigning on that. I mean, do you think we should stop installing gas boilers, for example?
It goes back to your question about supporting poorer people. Yes, with the right support is the answer in relation to that. It's the just transition point, because
there is a scheme at the moment that the government's got where you can get heat pumps put into your...
Yeah, so we've got a scheme as well. So we've got the Mayor's Energy Efficiency Fund. So to go back to the first part of your question is, you're spot on. We're the most centralised democracy in the Western world in relation to powers and resources that we have, and which is really important to your point. So roughly speaking, transport causes 1/3 of the problems, climate change and air pollution. The other 2/3 are, roughly speaking, 1/3 homes, 1/3 businesses. So what we've done in London, unlike the rest of the country, we've got planning rules in place, which I'm responsible for. Every new home in London, every new building in London must be not just net zero, often it's got to be air quality positive. No other part of the country's got that. We've managed to reduce carbon emissions from the GLA by more than 50%, from London by more than 20% since I became mayor.
It's what George Osborne was going to do, isn't it? But
inverted commas green crap. Inverted commas green crap.
Yeah.
So we're doing it ourselves, right, in London, without, despite the government, not because of the government. With the right government, we could not only have more powers and resources devolved to us, but we could have the sort of schemes you're talking about. And here's the reason why it's so exciting. Just imagine insulating homes, installing double, triple glazing, electric vehicle charging points, rapid charging points, solar panels, using energy from wind turbines, using the heat to create energy. These are future-proof jobs we could be creating in London, a Green New Deal in the real sense of the word. And so there's a reason why...
Why isn't that happening then?
Well, I think the combination of some of the things I talk about in this book, so in 2011 or 12, there's a famous phrase attributed to David Cameron to George Osborne, or the other way around. Let's get rid of the green crap. Green crap being the levies and the subsidies to feed-in tariffs and so forth, because they deprioritised the issue of climate change for reasons of austerity. And so one of the chapters...
They said they wouldn't rescue the economy by saving the planet.
Spot on. Yeah. And the point is, actually, if you change the framing of the argument, dealing with this problem creates opportunities. So we've been talking over the last year about the cost of living crisis, the cost of heating, electricity, as a consequence of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, because we're not energy secure, energy self-sufficient. Well, actually, that should be incentivizing the government to accelerate towards being self-sufficient, having energy security, wind, solar, and so forth, which, by the way, brings the prices down. Had Osborne not given into the green crap or the other way around, I'm not sure if Cameron or Osborne was lobbying for this, energy prices would be far less than they are now because of the subsidies, feed-in tariffs, and so forth. So what you need is, politicians to deal with the obstacles and come out with the solutions.
I suppose what I'm getting at is, do you share that sense of frustration that a lot of people talk about with politics at the moment? Because you're out of Westminster and you're in a sort of this unique mayoral situation that, that we don't seem to have big visions, big ideas. And that's what people are crying out for.
There's a story I tell in the book when I was at Hustings in 2016, organised by the Green Alliance. You can imagine what the Green Alliance is. And a woman came up to me and basically said, you're good in Hustings, you're the best candidate, but we don't trust you. Because you politicians, you say one thing for an election, once you win, something else takes over. And she couldn't name a single politician, a British politician, who'd won an election and was going big on green issues. And so I understand the cynicism that you're articulating from your listeners and from others across the country. This book is, a book of hope, I hope, but also explaining some of the obstacles that my profession faces. I'm saying to my profession, you can deal with these obstacles by learning some of the lessons I have. But I'm also saying to people who are cynical about my profession, actually don't give up on us. Because ultimately, as politicians who have the levers to bring about big change, and so there's got to be a coalition between activists, citizens, NGOs, politicians to bring about the change, the private sector to bring about this change, to action the big, bold ideas you're talking about.
Do you think at the moment, nationally, the Labour Party is offering a big, bold vision?
Oh, look! One of the 5 missions that Keir talks about is around this area, and I give a lot of credit to Ed Miliband in relation to this, in relation to a greener, fairer country.
But do you think it's hitting home?
I'm not sure whether it's landing with the public yet. We need to make sure these become good retail offers. One of the chapters is about how politicians deprioritize other issues once they win office, take precedence. The key thing we've got to do, I'll do it within the Labour Party, and your job as a journalist and others across the country is to do it outside of the Labour Party, is to hold the next Labour government to account in relation to the mission, the promises we're making. I think, if I'm honest, across the country, people don't realise the importance of tackling climate change and air pollution. Last summer, you and I both, as Londoners, experienced temperatures in excess of 31 degrees Celsius. For those that don't know, the London Fire Brigade last summer during 1 week was busier than any time since the Blitz during the Second World War. In the previous summer, we experienced flash flooding across our city. Across the country, there have been consequences of wildfires and river floods and so forth. So climate change is no longer a tomorrow issue, it's a today issue. But let me tell you a really scary stat. So in London, there's around 4,000 premature deaths a year because of air pollution. Across the country, north of 36,000 premature deaths linked with air pollution, from dementia, cancer, heart disease, to a whole host of other health issues directly caused by air pollution. Across the globe, there are more than 9 million air pollution-linked deaths, more deaths because of air pollution than smoking.
Right. I mean, it's a compelling argument, but I suppose the cynic might say, go back to that woman you talk about in the book saying you'll be distracted by housing and other issues. The problem is those other issues are really, really serious.
Agreed.
And they're causing huge amounts of misery and illness and sometimes death as well. And they include crime, housing, poverty, and all of those other issues. And that actually by framing something that you're not really in control of, which is climate change, is this a way for you to fight an election on things that, by dodging the blame for the other stuff, by saying this is the really big idea, don't focus on the shortage of housing in London, don't focus on knife crime, don't focus on the disastrous trust in police force, Look at me, I'm the guy with the ideas about the environment.
No, all those issues are important as well. What I'm saying is you shouldn't sacrifice air pollution and climate change because of the other issues. You've got to be able to walk and chew at the same time if you want to be a good leader. But let me deal with the 2 issues that are at the fore of Londoners' mind. One is housing, cost of living. Second one. Third one is immigration. Right? Here's the irony. By tackling climate change in the global south, you mentioned, the macro injustice of climate change. By addressing at the root the issue of climate change in the global south, you deal with climate displacement, which is one of the causes of migration to the global north. By making sure that new homes are energy efficient, not only and building more new homes, you're creating jobs, people pay tax, national insurance, dealing with the issue of poverty, but people's bills are less. So the new affordable homes we're building in London, record numbers, by the way, more since any time since the 1970s, all these new homes have smaller bills because of their energy efficiency than the older homes. So you're addressing the issue of energy efficiency, poverty, and new homes. So my point is, don't sacrifice climate change and air pollution because of the other issues. Actually, you can address some of the other issues by also tackling climate change and air pollution.
The government, the Conservative government, wants to reduce immigration. Do you think you need fewer immigrants or more immigrants in London?
I've no hesitation at all in saying we need more migrants in London. And let me explain why. So I'm not equivocating. It's really important for me to say this why. Park the social benefits to our city from migration. Park the cultural benefits to our city from migration. I've spent this morning with some of our city's leading business people who create jobs, wealth and prosperity. They've got a skills shortage and a labour shortage, right? We've got a pipeline of training up Londoners for future-proof jobs. I'm now in charge of the adult education budget. Even if every single Londoner who's currently not working was to be trained up to do these jobs, we still have massive number of vacancies, record numbers of vacancies in the health sector, in social care sector, in hospitality, in tech, and so forth. And so we need to have a sensible migration policy. And my point to the government is this: if you're worried about migration because it's unpopular in certain parts of the country, if you think you don't need it, and if other parts of the country either don't want it for political reasons or don't think they need it, I respect that. Devolve to cities like London the powers to have a regional shortage occupation list, so I can be in charge of deciding how many people come into London to help our economy. Because listen, half of our builders are above the age of 55. So we're trying to train up more builders. We've lost almost half of our EU-born builders in the last 7 years.
So Brexit's been a disaster from that point of view, has it?
It's a combination of the extreme hard Brexit on top of Brexit, but also the well-reported issues about low birth rates and so forth, and the pipeline of people coming into the economy and so forth. So we need migration, sensible migration.
Does your personal history as the son of migrants influence you at all in the way you approach this debate?
Without any hesitation, but also my experience mixing and mingling with migrants. Let me see what I mean by that. So my grandparents were migrants from India to Pakistan because of the partition. So they traveled basically from where they lived in UP to Karachi in Pakistan, traveling thousands of miles for a variety of reasons, not least because they wanted a better life for their children than for themselves. They didn't migrate to sit in their bums in Pakistan. They wanted a better life for themselves and their children. My parents migrated from Pakistan to London. In shorthand, Pakistan was Muslim majority in shorthand. India was Hindu and Sikh majority shorthand. And so there was above 2 to 3 million people lost their lives during this awful period in the history of India and Pakistan. My parents then came to London to make a better life for themselves and their children.
They were economic migrants.
They're also citizens of this country, by the way, at the time they came, which is really important to the story in relation to migration. So the experience of not just migrants, but the children of migrants is they are, by definition, upwardly mobile. They want to contribute. So somebody who comes there from Romania or Poland as a builder wants to work, often does work. There's the ethos we talk about in relation to, the migrant working culture, and similarly their children. They want them to do well because the long hours, often the manual workers have worked. They don't want their children to work the same long hours. They want a better life. Not in any way denigrating the manual work that my father's generation and mother's generation did, but that's the aspirations that these communities have. So my point is this fear people have, that migrants will come in, be benefits granted, is just not borne out by the evidence. But also, listen, the reason why there's a shortage of homes, the reason why people are waiting long periods for their parents to get decent healthcare, the reason why people can't get decent education from their state schools is not because of migrants, it's because of lack of investment by my profession of politicians. We're not building the hospitals, we're not investing in our state schools, we're not employing the right number of teachers and doctors and so forth. So don't blame the migrants, blame the politicians.
So having said what you've just said about your own personal experience, do you understand Suella Braverman and Rishi Sunak's apparent hostility towards the number of migrants coming into Britain?
Well, I mean, it's for Suella and Rishi, Suella Braverman and Rishi Sunak.
Because they're also the children of migrants.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's for them to explain why they believe what they believe. There's a thesis many people have.
Why do you think they're wrong?
Well, I think there's a view in the Conservative Party. You're successful because of your bootstraps, you tie yourself up, and you achieve what you've achieved because of your own brilliance as an individual, and everyone else should be as brilliant as you are. I speak from personal experience, right? My dad was a bus driver for more than, I don't know if you know this, for more than 25 years, public sector job, right? So this is a man who, passed away too early in 2003. And I don't mean this in any way to cause offence to my father or those who are bus drivers. My father did a job even though he was qualified to become an engineer because he's better paid doing a bus driver than doing other job, right? And he loved being a bus driver. We're really proud of him being a bus driver. We benefited from him being a bus driver, public sector job. We benefited from a council home provided by the state we paid the rent for. My father's children, my parents' children benefit from a state education. I benefit from university. My point being is, it's not my brilliance that I became the Mayor of London. It's because of the helping hand of the state and organs of the state that my family benefited. And so there is a Tory ideology that it's the individual brilliance, which is why Sunak's the Prime Minister, Braverman's the Home Secretary, James Cleverly is the Foreign Secretary. My analysis, based on my experience, is as brilliant as they are, they've got to give some of the credit to the state and organs of the state and the welfare state and so forth.
The figures are about to come out as we speak, probably more than 500,000 net migrants coming into Britain in 1 year. Do you think nationally that's a sustainable level?
I'm not sure where, in relation to the national numbers, where those migrants are going. The question about whether it's sustainable is how you frame the narrative. If the government of the last 13, 14 years hasn't been building the right numbers of homes, you've seen they've abolished targets. By the way, in London, we didn't abolish our target. We've met the target and smashed it. Abolishing housing building targets. You've had austerity for 13 years, not investing in the NHS, not investing in schooling. You've seen how the public sector is crumbling as a consequence and the other problems we have. Responsibility doesn't lie because we've got 500,000 or 600,000 or 700,000 migrants. The responsibility lies in this government's policy of the last 13, 14 years. What compounds that is the Brexit 2016 and the hard extreme Brexit we've got. So if you're framing the argument, is it sustainable? I think it's the wrong question to ask. The question to ask is, why is our government failing in relation to some of the things that are crucial to the success of a country?
Well, I suppose I frame it that way because it gets discussed this way, that people will say, well, hang on, in 10 years, our population is going to grow by 5 million or more. Is that okay? Are you okay with that?
Well,
if it brings economic benefits and you can house them, and if you get a Labour government and you build schools and you build houses and all the rest of it,
no, because
you have no problem with population rising by that amount.
There's nothing wrong per se with growth as long as you plan for it. The problem with growth that's without planning is it leads to unintended consequences that can be negative. Obvious example. In the space of a few days, you've got a huge number of new people in an area without the right infrastructure, GP places, accommodation, school places, and all the sort of stuff you need around it, what we call the soft infrastructure. My point is this: a good government should not be allowing the market to dictate what happens around the country in relation to migration. A good government, when the market isn't working, has got to get involved in the market and fixing the market. That means not relying upon the private sector to build the homes we need, not relying upon individuals to make the right choices. What you do is say, listen, we've got a situation where we may have migrants coming in. Do we have the infrastructure to support those migrants? School places, GP places, I talked about, the right sort of accommodation, the right sorts of jobs. This is a government that over the last 13 years has not been one that's encouraged better remuneration, better wages for people who are working, particularly in some jobs. And that's why you sometimes see this ridiculous situation where you've got, working class, inverted commas, indigenous people, having animus towards, working class new arrivals. The problem is the government not regulating the employer market in relation to the remuneration these workers get.
The government's just announced they're cracking down on students' visa holders bringing in family members. And this is a route at the moment through which we get a lot of immigration. You think that's wrong then?
Yes, this is a whack-a-mole immigration policy. Let me tell you why I think it's counterproductive. So talent, brains from certain parts of the world are deciding where to go to. These are postgraduates deciding where to go to. And they can choose a number of places to go to. They can go to America, Canada, Australia, the UK, other countries in the EU that not unreasonably are going to wealthier countries where they want to contribute, get a decent remuneration, send remittances home. They may decide in the future to stay here, who knows? But they are qualified people who are doing high-skilled jobs. So we took a decision a number of years ago this government did, not me, the Conservative government, to say to postgraduates doing PhDs and others, you come here for your studies and you'll leave straight away. Other countries didn't do that. So not unreasonably, there was a big cliff edge drop in relation of talent coming to the UK. Eventually, universities said to the government, what you're doing is bonkers. We can't get the talent anymore because of this policy you've got. And to give Joe Johnson, it was Joe Johnson who was the higher education minister, credit, because he deserves credit. He managed to persuade the government to do a U-turn on that policy, which meant people were choosing to come to our country rather than the Canadas, the Australias, the Americans. And it's really worth emphasizing. These are talented people who have got skills that we need, who are choosing where to go to, depending on whether they may stay there afterwards, whether they can bring their spouse, and all that sorts of stuff. And so what I predict will happen is the government's going to announce this policy trying to court support in red wall seats and elsewhere for reasons that we can understand, thinking that it's going to reduce migration. It's not going to really make a big difference on numbers of 500, 600, 700,000. Instead of it'll give the impression the government's taking action. Instead, what it'll do is mean that fewer talented people are coming to our country, which to me makes no sense.
And do you think there is racism in the immigration debate, the way it's conducted, in mainstream political parties?
I think those of us who live in the city who benefit from migration have got to have empathy and understanding, where with those in other parts of the country who fear that one of the explanations for bad public services is because immigrants have taken it all. It's not the case. But what politicians do is one of two things. They play on people's fears. It's because of the other, oldest trick in the book, or they address people's fears. I want to be that generation of politicians that addresses your fears as somebody who may be working class in another part of the country who is worried about this, to explain why it's not the case. And that's why I'd like some balance in relation to this issue. And by the way, we've also got a call out, and you did a good job recently, I'm not just sucking up to you because I'm on your podcast, in relation to a government minister spreading misinformation that goes unchallenged. And too often what's happened is, and you know, my party does it sometimes, politicians do it sometimes, the public does it sometimes, not calling out a lie. So, when the government is saying things that they claim to be in the convention that clearly aren't in the convention, the UN convention in relation to asylum seekers and refugees, the UNHCR, we ought to call them out.
Right. I mean, that's you're very good at these answers, but is it racist? Is it racism?
Sometimes.
That we're talking about?
Sometimes. Yeah. Not all the time. Not all the time.
Not all the time.
No, and I'm quite clear about this. Listen, when I knock on a door and somebody says, I'm voting BNP, I don't think they're racist. What I do instead is I say, why? And we try to have a conversation about why they are. And it's really important to understand that. And my personal experience tells me this. I'll tell you why. When I was about 22, 23, I was a member of the Labour Party in Tooting, and there was an election in Millwall where the BNP won a by-election, a guy called Derek Beacon. And so I went to campaign in the subsequent election to try and get the BNP guy no longer a councillor. And I met a number of families who had voted BNP, and I didn't think they weren't racist, but they'd voted BNP for a good reason. There was a housing policy. They were worried about a housing policy. They were housing. The concern was others have been housed, not my family, not my eldest son who's been waiting for 3 years in the housing waiting list. And I don't think people who espouse less migration are necessarily racist.
Yeah, but sometimes they are.
Sometimes they are.
Because politicians will often say this, it's not racist to talk about immigration, and not all people who vote that way are racist. Some of them are.
Some of them are.
And we don't acknowledge that.
You've got to call a spade, and some of them are. But it's really important. So I'll give you a personal example. Look, when Donald Trump first started being beastly towards me, I went on the record and said he's not a racist. I said, listen, sometimes people can say things that are racist. It doesn't make them a racist. But after a while, you get so much evidence, you got to conclude the man's a racist, right? And the same goes for some politicians and some people. I do not think, talking about immigration is racist. I do not think, advocating for less immigration is racist, but latching onto some of these really important debates sometimes are racist.
Do you blame Trump, incidentally, for the lack of your now personal freedom because you've got constant security? Is it his fault?
Yeah, some of it is linked with Trump. There's one of life's wonderful ironies. So some of the threats I received are from, inverted commas, the Islamist extreme in relation to it's not possible to be a Westerner and a true Muslim. Some of it is because of what Trump advocates. By the way, the same stuff, you can't be a Westerner and a Muslim. And so some of the threats I've received are because of this wing. some of it is because of this wing, and but there's been independent analysis of the racial hatred that I receive on social media, and there are big spikes. There have been big spikes whenever Trump gets involved in the debate.
Just incidentally, again, what's your view on the P word? I mean, whenever I've been called the P word, I want the right to say I was called what the word is and say it. Now I can't even do that. I have to come in and say, I was called the P word. I'd quite like to own the word. What do you think about that?
No, you've got to be very careful, because what you do... Sorry, I don't mean to lecture you, sorry. The reason why I don't do that is because I don't want to give racists an excuse to use it because Sadiq Khan's using it, so I'm using it.
Right.
The same goes with the N-word with rapping. So one of the things that if you look at the history of the N-word and how loaded it is, I don't think it's good enough to say because Jay-Z uses it, I can use it. That's not good enough. The problem, the reason why I rudely interrupted you when you suggested that was because Krishnan Guru carries some weight whether you like it or not. And so people will say, I'm afraid, Krishnan Guru uses it, so why can't I use it?
Okay, no, well, that's the flip side of the argument. I want to talk to you about policing in London. Obviously, I mean, it's been a terrible time while you've been mayor in terms of trust in policing. The police have been called institutionally corrupt, racist, sexist, homophobic, everything you can possibly imagine. You helped get rid of Cressida Dick, the last commissioner. How much of this is your responsibility?
But as the mayor, I've got to, be leading the fight to sort the police out. I'm the mayor of London. It's got to be my responsibility whether I like it or not.
You've been mayor a while now, haven't you?
Yeah, park for a second the fact that, there's dual accountability with the Home Secretary and stuff and the government, park all that stuff. The fact is, look, I'm a Londoner. I've got skin in the game. I remember growing up in this city, being routinely stopped and searched, as indeed my friends were. The advice from my dad was, when you see the police, it should be yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir, because that was our experience with the police. I lived through Macpherson. Some of the lawyers involved in that case, close dear friends of mine, as indeed Dorian began. For some time, I've been saying there are systemic cultural issues in the police service. Often, by the way, the sole person in a position of power and influence saying that. On the one side, you had the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, the Policing Minister, the Head of Her Majesty's Inspectorate, the Commissioner. On the other side, you had me and Londoners. By the way, I'm with Londoners in relation to this, so I don't say I'm by myself. Londoners were with me in relation to this. And so the reality is, I don't feel a source of pride that the independent review asked to be done from Dame Louise Casey led to a conclusion of institutional racism, institutional misogyny, institutional homophobia. What I need to do is to take that forward and make sure that reforming the police is an integral part of my mayoralty. That's an important legacy for me, because I will live in London for the rest of my life, and we've got to sort this out.
But why have you been unable to do it? Are you saying it's because all of these interests who line up and denied that there was a problem?
It's really hard. I mean, let me tell you why it's really hard. You've got roughly speaking, 30,000 police officers, another 10,000 staff, big culture in relation to this, and everyone who's in a position of power influence says there's no problem. So you've got to change the culture in the police service when people don't accept there's a problem. That's why Dame Louise Casey's report is so important, because here's somebody who didn't go and speak to just ordinary Londoners or to activists or to lawyers. That's what Sir William Macpherson did, by the way. She spoke to police officers. She spoke to Black, Asian, minority ethnic officers. She spoke to women police officers. She spoke to lesbian, gay, bi, trans police officers. Their experience inside the Met Police Service was one of experiencing racism, misogyny, homophobia. And that's why you can't brush it under the carpet.
But this wouldn't have come as a surprise to you. The Casey report, you knew all of that stuff.
I know, but you need to...
So what was going on when you were talking to Cressida Dick for all those years saying, I've had these conversations with her where she basically used to say, what we've done in the police is probably more than you've done at ITN or Channel 4 or the BBC or all these sort of organizations. She genuinely thought the police had changed.
So it's interesting how I've had 3 commissioners, Bernard Hogan-Howe, Cressida Dick and Mark Rowley. To give Bernard Hogan-Howe credit, Bernard Hogan-Howe was of a school of thought, and he deserves credit for this. Look, whether or not I believe there's institutional racism doesn't matter. The fact that you think there's a problem is enough for me to try and sort it out, right? Which is him having emotional intelligence to recognize there's a problem and wanting to take action. The problem was there was a lack of recognition from Cressida Dick. Park for a second institutional racism, or even institutional homophobia, institutional misogyny, and you mentioned institutional corruption. Park all that for a second. She refused to accept there were systemic or cultural issues. And so I was even, and there's, this is about a public record. I was even given a way out to the previous commissioner about, look, if you don't accept the IR phrase, I'm not fussed about that as long as we get to the ends, which is a reforming the police service. And it was incredibly difficult. And, you saw, you reported on, and others have as well, the flack I got for taking the stance I did. But listen, I remember in 2020, when George Floyd was brutally murdered in Minneapolis, making the point, the trauma's felt in London. You speak to black people in London, they felt the trauma of this because it was a but for the grace of God moment. So in the absence of the police taking action, we had to ourselves, the Deputy Mayor Sophie and then Debbie Weeks-Bernard, with a number of community meetings across London, and we came up with an action plan to address the issue of trust, transparency and confidence, despite the Met Police leadership, not because of it.
You now have a commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, who accepts everything that was said, but refuses to accept institutional anything because he claims some people think that means you're calling everybody racist or everybody misogynist. That is still a degree of denial.
Well, on that particular issue, Sir Mark knows I disagree with him. Yeah. I think he's wrong on that. If Sir Mark didn't accept the recommendations of Dame Lou's case, that'd be a problem. If Sir Mark didn't accept the systemic cultural problems, that'd be a problem. If Sir Mark in his first 6 months hadn't made the progress he had, that'd be a problem. But, yes, I might disagree with him about that issue, and it is a big issue, by the way, because unless I think there's an issue there. But on all the other things, I've got to tell you, he's been a breath of fresh air in that organisation. Because he's trying to bring about the sort of transformation the police service hasn't seen since the 1970s. I mean, it's not true, by the way, as some people believe, and I know this because I lived through this as somebody who specialised in this area of law, that once Macpherson was published, the then commissioner, Paul Condon, started to suddenly take action and the police service changed in London. It's not true. Not just if you speak to black Londoners, speak to lawyers involved in this area, speak to Doreen's family. And so what Sir Mark is trying to do is something not done since Robert Mark in the 1970s, which is to, bring about root and branch change in the police service. And so, of course, I'll challenge him, but I'll also support him.
And what do you say to young Londoners now, including your own kids, about how they should feel about the police, whether they should trust the police?
So I tell my daughters and their friends to trust the police, but their response is, but the evidence is to the contrary. Obviously, my daughters are female as well, so there's the additional issue, not of race as you and I discussed, but the institutional misogyny, the awful cases of Sarah Everard and what David Carrick ended up doing. And so the police have got to be sensitive to the fact that for very good reasons, particularly women, particularly at night time, won't trust somebody pulling out a warrant card in plain clothes for obvious reasons, right? And so the police need to be emotionally intelligent, not to put a woman in that position. So they shouldn't be approaching a woman if they're in plain clothes by themselves, right? They should make sure the uniformed officers approaching women, particularly at night time. So it works both ways. So my advice to young people and to Londoners is we've got to trust the police. We police by consent. We've got to come forward if we've been the victims of crime, if we've witnessed a crime, and to join the police service.
But when they say, well, why do we have to trust the police when there is all this evidence to the contrary? How do you persuade your daughters that, they should change their attitude?
Well, they should change. Well, the police have got to change their attitude. The police have got to recognise there are these challenges, but at the same time, we've got to recognise living in a democracy, in the society we live in. We don't believe in, and nor should we ever get to the place where we self-police or have vigilantes. We've got to rely upon the police to sort themselves out, and it's in the police's interest, because unless there's more trust, there's not going to be less crime. Because if people aren't coming forward to be victims or witnesses or to join the police service, crime's going to go through the roof.
Do you think the prospect of a Labour government would make your job as Mayor of London dramatically different?
Forgive the pun, but it'd be a breath of fresh air. Absolutely. Of course it will be. Look, listen, the thing is, of course I want a Labour government for obvious reasons, but actually I want a government that's pro the environment, pro clean air, pro London, pro migration, pro building generally affordable homes.
But you can be bigger and bolder on all of these issues than Keir Starmer can, because Keir Starmer's got to worry about all those marginal seats.
Yeah, but also what Keir Starmer should do over the next 18 months is obviously make sure that we earn the votes of those who couldn't lend us their votes in 2010, 2015, 2017, 2019. He's got a really important job to earn their votes. When he's earned their vote and won the general election, he's got to do something really important, which is give power away. He's got to be giving power away to Andy Burnham, Steve Rotherham, Andy Street, Tories as well. Ben Houghton in Tees Valleys, Scotland and Wales and London. I mentioned earlier on that, we're the most centralized democracy in the Western world. We get to spend 7% of taxes raised in London, 7%, New York 50%, Tokyo 70%. I look at envy with my colleagues in Germany and France and other parts of Europe. What Keir Starmer's got to do, if he's, and I'm confident he will do this, is to devolve powers and resources away from Whitehall, but also recognise that actually London is different to the Red Wall seats, is different to Greater Manchester, is different to Scotland and Wales. And so this one-size-fits-all solution that Whitehall and Westminster had just doesn't work anymore.
Do you think you'll end up fighting a Labour government for more of what you want?
Yeah,
you won't always be in lockstep, will you?
Yeah, well, I think there's going to be situations, and we've got to, as a healthy democracy, not be scared of this, to see disagreement between politicians from the same side. Ken Livingstone had two prime ministers, Tony and Gordon. Boris Johnson had two prime ministers, Gordon Brown and David Cameron. I've had five prime ministers in 7 years. And so with Keir Starmer, there'll be lots of things that hopefully we can agree on. But there'll be some things where we disagree. And for the simple reason, my job is to be the champion advocate for this city, persuading the government, brackets Labour government, to do right by London. And that'll be an argument, debate we have. Hopefully, those arguments will happen in a private space, and hopefully I'll win the argument, so that there'll be no need to have a discussion, debate, argument in the public space.
I saw a headline from one of the interviews you did which said you wanted 6 terms.
Well,
would that honestly be healthy?
My wife fell off the chair when I got home. It was said in jest to a brilliant journalist called Simon Hatstone, saying, he was asking me the question about legacy. And I said, listen, you talk about legacy when you're coming towards the end of your political career. I've still got another 6 terms to go. And he put it in haiku. My wife said, whoa, 6 terms, that's 2040. I was joking.
So if you could change the world in any way, how would you change it?
I think the really important thing we've got to do is to try and turn what I call passive consumers into active citizens. What do I mean by that? I think the way our country's worked over a period of time is people think the only way to get involved is at most voting once every 4 or 5 years. That's not an active citizen, that's a passive consumer. And by the way, lots of people don't vote. So what I mean by being an active citizen is get involved in your community. It could be through Nextdoor, it could be, a WhatsApp group and so forth, whether it's cleaning your street, whether it's, picking up litter, whether it's joining a political party, whether it's joining a think tank, whether it's, anything that's important that you feel passionate about in relation to you. I think being a citizen is a two-way relationship. You expect something from your politicians, but also you should give something back as well. And my big thing about, and it's in this book as well, is about what I want ideally is for us not to be passive consumers, which is, what many of us are, but active citizens.
Sadiq Khan, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for sharing your ways to change the world. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, then please do give us a rating or a review, and other people can find this podcast. You can watch all of these interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel, and our producer is Alice Wagstaff. Until next time, bye-bye.